Our next speaker is a long-time campaigner on environment issues and social justice, and she's the Socialist Alliance candidate for this coming election. I'm pleased to introduce Jess WAW.
I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land. Respect for elders past, present and future. This land was never ceded. 0. 0 is the number of scientific peer-reviewed papers that say climate change is not happening. 0. Yet the coal lobby, yet our government, yet the coalition say that there's some kind of debate about whether or not climate change is happening, which is lies. Every day the evidence is mounting. The past decade was the hottest ever. The past year was the hottest ever. And the past month was the hottest July ever recorded. Every day that we fail to act has catastrophic consequences. And I don't mean potential catastrophic consequences. Dangerous climate change is here now. Russia has entered its 7th week of heatwave, with giant firestorms that swept 114,000 hectares of the country. The current floods in Pakistan have been deemed by the UN the worst natural disaster ever. It's adversely affected nearly 14 million people, left 500,000 homeless, and destroyed 1.4 million acres of agricultural land. And in Australia, we're in the middle of a federal election campaign, which is a strange combination of equal parts boring and frightening. Boring because the ridiculous rhetoric that the major parties are putting forward, saying things like moving Australia forward, or I care about this country, or real change. But change for who? What is your policy? And do you mean by change that you're going to help the coal industry make greater profits? Or do you mean your change is actually going to ensure a safe planet for all of us? It's frightening because of the lack of concrete ways the major parties are putting forward to tackle climate change. It's frightening because their policies are completely inadequate, and like it or not, we are going to see a Labor or Liberal government elected at this election. And it's frightening because the main thing being put forward is that we need to talk more about it. Not action, we just need to talk a little bit more. Talk while the planet burns. Apparently, the solution is that we need to buy new cars. That's one of the policies that the Labor Party is putting forward. It's a handout to the car industry, a massively polluting industry in this country, and it's a delay tactic while the planet burns. Meanwhile, both major parties can't stop talking about refugees to blame and to distract. Around 1% of migration to Australia last year were refugees, and 0.1% of people who arrived in Australia arrived by boat. And yet this is the main thing the politicians want to talk about. What's actually needed to combat the climate crisis? What do we need to do in Australia right now? Well, the Socialist Alliance stands for 100% renewable energy Australia-wide by 2020. The major parties try and tell us that this is not economically possible, and they try and tell us that the technology doesn't exist to do it. Well, there's a plan that's been released by a group called Beyond Zero Emissions. They're a group of engineers, scientists and activists who've done an incredibly amazing plan. I encourage people to go out and look for it, that shows, based on technology that's commercially available right now, we can absolutely do it through a combination of solar, thermal and wind, and that it will cost this country 3 to 3.5% of GDP a year over 10 years. Now, just to compare it to something else that's happened through consecutive governments, that's about the equivalent of how much we've decreased the corporate tax rate since 1988. So we could simply stop increasing the massive profits of polluting industries and actually ensure a safe planet for us all. Another important thing we have to tackle is the agricultural industry. We need to build a sustainable agricultural industry in this country. So we need to move away from monocultures and fossil fuel-based chemical pesticides and fertilisers, and we need to move into a situation of urban agriculture. A massive part of the pollution that comes through food production is because of the enormous kilometres that our food has to come for us to eat. We need to start growing food where we live. We also need a huge overhaul of the transport industry. So while the government is trying to say that if you own an old car, they'll pay you to buy a new car, what we actually need to be doing is massively expanding both public transport and particularly rail infrastructure to enable trucks and cars to get off the road, to enable people to make a choice not to get in their car in the morning. We can't just talk about climate change, in my opinion, we have to talk about climate justice. So there are workers in this country who are employed in polluting industries that we necessarily have to phase out for the future of this planet. Our policy is that those people should be retrained on full pay into these industries where we're going to necessarily need a massive increase in skills. So into the 100% renewable energy industry, into the new agriculture, and into a massive expansion of public transport. Another aspect has to be refugees. So it's currently the position in Australia that climate refugees, people fleeing because their country's going underwater, don't count as refugees. We don't acknowledge that those people have a right to life, a right to seek safe haven. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change predicted an estimated 150 million refugees worldwide by 2050. So I think any aspect of a climate change movement has to also take up the question of refugees, has to acknowledge that we should welcome climate refugees, and part of that is Australia's historic role in creating the problem in the first place. The industrialised countries around the world created this problem. It's the only humane thing we can do, and frankly, we can do it, which is different to a lot of the poor third world countries who don't necessarily have the capacity, the technology, the resources to implement a whole range of both mitigation and adaptation measures that we do. So we have a responsibility to make changes here, we have a responsibility to accept people here who are having to flee their countries, and we have a responsibility to enable other countries to actually make the changes that the planet needs. These measures that I've just gone through are the reason that the voteclimate.org.au website has actually advocated a vote one for the Socialist Alliance in this federal election. That website was put together by one of the people who founded Beyond Zero Emissions. That same website advocates a vote two for the Greens, and we see the fight against climate change as a real red-green alliance, together with everyone who wants to take up this fight. A vote for the Socialist Alliance supports progressive change in this country. It gives confidence to people that we can break with the completely undemocratic two-party system that means we're seeing no solutions on the table in this election. And it's a vote for a grassroots voice in Parliament and on the streets. But what do we do right now when neither major party is saying they're going to make the changes needed this election? Do we just wait another 3.5 years while the planet burns? I say no. The history of progressive change in this country has happened because ordinary people have come out onto the streets and forced our government to make the changes that the planet needs. A really good small example is that the green buses in this city didn't just appear. They were the result of a concerted campaign for free and frequent public transport in this city. That's a victory for the climate movement here, but we need to generalise that to victories countrywide that mean we can actually win the changes that the planet needs. So I encourage everyone here to come out, to continue to come out, to encourage people. We know that people in a widespread way acknowledge that climate change is happening and they're concerned. But do they just think this? Do they just privately think this, and do they just think this in their homes? Or are they willing to come out and act? Because the only way that we are going to get what the majority of people in this country want is through the action of the majority of people in this country. Thank you.